Chapter 1. On the Road to London. It came on to rain again. Out of the grey, sad sky the drops fell with miserable steadiness, to splash in the mud that bogged the road and filled the swollen ditches until they overflowed. Hunching his shoulders, Guy Sands plodded grimly through the downpour. The sooner he left this troubled Midlands, the better he would be pleased. Still dank from previous soakings, his frieze coat and velveteen breeches filled with moisture again until they dripped. Long ago he had forgotten that his broken shoes squelched over his ankles with mire and water, and that his stockings were in holes. He had not been dry for nearly a week. His thoughts bemused him as he trudged through the rain. By now he was so tired and wretched that he did not hear the horses, and they were upon him before he knew it. They came up from behind, across the open fields, where the going was easier, and the patter of the rain drowned their hoof-beats. In those days there were few hedges, except near the villages. Most of the land lay unfenced. Guy did not realise what was happening until they crashed down into the lane all around him. Next moment he was hemmed in by a jostling crowd of riders. He had a quick vision of the wet, matted sheen of the animals' coats, brown and bay, and the scent of reeking horses filled his nostrils. A squat figure thrust his mount across the way, heeling the beast into him, so that he had to step back nimbly to avoid being trampled. "Hold hard, cully," rasped a hoarse voice. "Who are ye, and where are ye going in this plaguey weather?" The men were soldiers, a dragoon patrol scouting for rebels. Dressed in red tunics and buckskin breeches, with great clumsy boots over their knees, they glowered down at him in an ugly mood. Their jackets were darkened to a sully crimson by the rain, boots and breeches caked to the thigh with filth. Sitting their beasts in the chilly deluge, their arms and equipment squeaked and jingled with the fidgeting of the horses. The spokesman was their corporal, a thick-set fellow with a hard brown face. Easing himself gingerly in his stirrups, he spat coarsely through rags of yellow teeth. Guy heard the thin whisper of his breeches against the saddle, and guessed at his discomfort. Wet leather is no kind surface for a man's thighs to rub against, even if he is used to rough riding. "Well?" the corporal challenged again. "Are ye dumb or what? Speak up, ye great stupid bumpkin, or I'll find a way to make ye." Guy was a little scared. These were bad times for travellers. The Jacobite army, under Prince Charles Edward, was not far away, he had heard, closer than he had thought when he came down from Chester. With an effort he steadied himself and found his voice. "I am making for London, sir. My name is Guy Sands, if you please." The corporal ran a contemptuous eye over Guy's poor weather-stained clothes and bedraggled appearance. He sneered. Trying to mimic his north country accent, he replied, "Well, Guy Sands, if you please. Ye talk most varly like a Scotchman. Blister me if you don't." A note of ferocity gave a sudden edge to his voice as he added, "And what does a beggarly Scot padding the Staffordshire lanes if he be not a cursed rebel? Tell me that." "I am no rebel," Guy retorted, stung by his rudeness, "nor am I a Scot. My home was Northumberland until I left it but lately." Plainly the corporal did not believe him, for he spat again, and eyed him with a sour grin. If the dragoon's own twang was any guide, he was a southerner, and probably could not tell Scots speech from any other that was used in the north. A trooper broke in. "Look'ee, corporal, he's but a lad, too young to be a-marching with the Jacks, I reckon." "Do ye now, my bully?" The corporal was sarcastic. Then I'll thank ye to hold your clacking tongue until you're spoke to, unless you fancy a dose of number 1 when we get back. Young he may be, but I'll warrant he's ripe enough for gallows fruit." Turning on Guy again, he snapped, "Give an account of yourself. Which road did you take? And what did you see, and when? Speak truth now, or your neck may answer for it yet." Guy explained that he was an orphan. His parents were recently dead, in an epidemic of the typhus which ravaged the country at frequent intervals, and had left him without kin or money. Wishing to get away from his birthplace, with its sombre memories, he had taken a notion to see something of the world, and had set out to walk to London. At that time, many country people believed the old tale that gold lay on the pavements of the capital, only waiting to be picked up. Riches, they thought, were to be got easily if one risked the journey. Guy was not as simple as that, but was determined to better himself. Unless he had very ill luck, he thought courage and honesty and hard work could not fail to bring fortune. He did not then suspect the fate ahead of him, which was to darken his future with its sable wings. The corporal's hard, crafty stare rested on him while he talked. He had to recount every detail of his journey, and give an exact description of the places he had visited during the last few days. Grudgingly, the dragoon accepted his tale at last. "We had a brush with some Highlanders yesterday," the soldier growled. "They got clear, but we're still hunting for 'em. If you happen across any such, my lad, do your duty and inform on 'em directly. There's a hemp collar waiting for all who aid the king's enemies, don't forget." He put his tired gelding on the bit, collecting it under him. A raindrop trickled down his blunt nose and blobbed off the end, as he turned the beast with a rein on its neck. "My advice to ye is to get forward as quick as you can," were his parting words, "else you may find yourself in a pickle you won't talk your way out of so easy. If any of them Highland Jacks get you, they'll slit your wizened as neat as a pin, just for the sake of your ragamuffin clothes." With that he barked a sharp order and clattered off down the lane, with his men behind him. Watching them go, Guy plodded after them through the driving rain. A little way further on, the dragoons pulled out of the lane and struck across the field once more. Soon they were out of sight. He picked his way along the sodden roads, heedless of its rough stones and pockets of mud, except when he came to a deeper hole than usual and had to skirt it. Like all country roads of that date, it was no more than a villainous track, ill kept and neglected, which had become almost impassable in bad weather. Once again he began to abuse himself for being such a fool as to attempt the journey to London at this season, and still more for trying it when the whole country was so troubled with strife and rebellion. In the last hamlet he had passed through, he had learned that the Jacobite army had turned back from Derby, and was in full retreat. No doubt the Highlanders the corporal had mentioned were stragglers, adrift from the main body. Guy hoped he would not meet them. Times were bad for such poor wayfarers as himself. Folk kept their doors shut and barred by day as well as by night. They dreaded the wild clansmen who marched with the Stuart prince, thieving and foraging, no less than the government troops, who were no better. Both sides were fierce and rapacious, and the soldiery looted anything that was not too heavy to lift, especially if it could be eaten. The Highlanders were half savage, ragged, and quarrelsome, most of them speaking only Gaelic. Their outlandish habits and the barbaric appearance of their kilts and raw hairy legs gave rise to all kinds of horrifying rumours about them. On the other hand, many of the rankers in the king's regiments were jailbirds, or broken men of one kind or another. All were regarded as ruffians and social outcasts. Discipline was brutal, and the life harsh and squalid. with poor rations and plenty of lashes. Few joined the army from choice. Because of this, the country people were surly and frightened, showing little charity to strangers. They kept to themselves in their little communities, hoping the rebellion would pass them by. Guy Sands had not slept in a bed for many weary nights. The weather had been vile, ever since he had crossed the Pennines into Lancashire. He made this detour with a packman, to earn a few shillings on the road by helping to manage the train of pack ponies laden with wool. Since then, it had continued damp and bitter cold, with marrow-freezing bouts of sleet, until he had forgotten what it felt like to be warm and dry. Lately he had slept where he could, in barns and cow-byres, in any hole or corner he could find that gave a little shelter from the pitiless rain and cold. The afternoon grew darker while he pressed forward. Soon it would be night. Looking about him, he kept his eyes open for a likely spot. He had hardly any money, and knew there was no hope of a decent lodgings until he reached a quieter district, where there was no fear of strangers. As before, he would have to make a den wherever he could, like a wild beast. The countryside was barren and thinly inhabited in this area. Most of it was heath and scrub, which rose and fell steeply, full of banks and lonely hollows, which seemed lost and evil in the growing twilight. Only rarely was there a miserable patch of tilled land. He trudged on for several miles until the dusk settled thick around him. By then the rain had stopped, but the starving wind still cut deep into his bones. The lane became rougher, no more than a cart track, whose ruts were brimming with mud, which hid their ankle-breaking depth. Guy floundered along it, wearily, when he caught sight of a building on his right. It was a hut of some kind, crouched in a wilderness of firs about 100 yards from the lane. He clambered across the ugly ditch at the roadside and made across the heath towards it. Nowhere in sight was there any other sign of human dwelling or occupation. The gorse rolled on to the crest of a steep bank, beyond which he could see the loom of the Derbyshire uplands, grey and misty against the distant sky. No sound even of a bird or a rustling leaf, for the wind had dropped with uncanny suddenness. Nothing, except the faint drip of water from the sodden firs. In silence he stood outside the hut. It was a crazy shed, rotten with age and neglect. It leaned to one side, its roof cocked up foolishly like a drunkard's bonnet. Staring at it, Guy felt a mixture of sensations. One part of him was glad, because it offered shelter for the night. But deep down in his heart, a tiny voice tried to tell him not to go in. He did not know why, but he had to force himself to approach it. The door sagged on its hinges tipsily. Green moss grew on its planks, pale and blotched, as if it suffered with some hideous disease. Fiercely, Guy put his fear from him. "What's the matter with you, you great booby?" he asked himself. "You're not scared of such nonsense at your age, surely. Get on, you why-faced ninny, and see what's behind yon door." For all his bold words, his knees trembled as he put his hand to the rusty latch. The place had a dire uncanny look in the poor twilight, deserted and eerily silent. It seemed to frown at him like a thing alive and unhappy. He had to drag at the door to get it open. It whimpered, tottering, the sound unnaturally distinct in the lonely evening. He crept inside. It was very dark, He stood there and listened, while his eyes adjusted themselves to the gloom. An old horn lantern hung from a nail by the threshold. He took it down and examined it, and found that it held a stub of candle bedded in its own grease. He wondered whether to light it, but decided to let it alone. Putting the lantern back on its nail, he told himself that it would be wiser to stay in the dark. At night the glowing of the candle might attract visitors he would not welcome. If any of these Highland rebels come this way, I'll do better lacking their company, he thought. Though truly, they may be less evil gentry than the soldier said. All the same, I won't invite 'em. Turning from the lantern, he peered through the heavy shadow to make out what he could of the hut's interior. To his joy, there was a great heap of straw which almost covered the floor of beaten earth. Eagerly he picked some up and smelt it. It was a trifle musty, but dry and clean. With a sigh he crawled into the pile and kicked off his shoes. This was luxury. He made himself a nest and pulled the rustling stalks over him, curled up in his wet clothes. Supperless he might be, but at least he would be warm for one night. Really, I am in luck, he said to himself. It's a cleaner bed than any I would get in a village alehouse. He was asleep before the words finished passing through his brain.